Oh, you got very quiet, right on cue. Yeah, you've done this before, I think. Welcome, everyone, to this event of the Judaic Studies program at the University of Maine. Tonight, we will be hearing from David Barnouw, who is right over here. Yeah, you get to meet him in a moment. He's an independent scholar and emeritus researcher at the Dutch Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies, and a renowned expert on Anne Frank, and follows her emergence as a global phenomenon and what this means for her historical person and her legacy as a symbol of the Holocaust. He's currently, and I believe this is still the case, currently updating his 2003 book, Who Betrayed Anne Frank? And his latest, The Phenomenon of Anne Frank, originally published in Dutch, was published in 2018 by Indiana University Press. So on behalf of our co-sponsors this evening, and there are a number of them, let me make sure I get all of them here. The UMaine History Department, the Honors College here at the University of Maine, the McGillicuddy Humanities Center, and the Jewish Community Endowment Association, all of whom are teaming up to make this evening possible. And with that, I will hand things over to David Barnouw.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. It's nice being here in Maine. Who betrayed Anne Frank and who owns Anne Frank? It's title. I thought I have to do something on it. If you can't hear me, please raise your voice. But, at the end of the Q&A, but when there is some really important question I don't understand at all what you mean, please raise your hand and maybe I can give an answer. But there will be time enough. As a general introduction, I can tell a little bit about myself and how I came involved in this. My grandfather was a minister, a liberal Calvinist minister. And during wartime in 1943, he was arrested with two of his colleagues and spent some time, 3-4 months, in a German concentration camp in the Netherlands because they have been helping a Jew. My father worked as a conscript laborer in Berlin during wartime. 500,000 Dutch men had to go to work in Germany or whatever. My father could try to escape it, but he was afraid that the Germans would go after his father again. So he decided to go to Germany. He only had nice stories about his life there. It was a little bit strange, I think. He talked about going to cinema, to theater. Yeah, there was some bombing, things like that. And years ago, when the Berlin Wall was still there, I invited him to come over with me to Berlin to visit his old factory. And at first he didn't want it, but I said no, it's important, etc. He agreed, and I had asked my mother too to come, and she refused flatly. They were engaged during the wartime, and she could hear and see day and night bombers flying over the Netherlands, going to bomb my father. That was her idea, so she didn't want to go there. This is part of not abnormal. Most people of my peer group have something like that, have family who have done it, etc., etc. And in my upbringing, it wasn't the talk of every day, but you knew about it. And there were some For instance, I have two brothers. My father was not so strict. My mother said, please don't come home with a German girlfriend. But they said the same about please don't come home with a Roman Catholic girlfriend. Later that changed, and they were happy we came home with girlfriend. So partly I've been influenced by the Second World War, but that's with everybody. For instance, I've never read Anne Frank's diary when I was young. Why should I? I could ask my parents what happened in the Netherlands during wartime, and that's for my peer group, of course. The upbringing did realize that I went to work after some other working years, work at the Dutch Institute for War Documentation. That's the old name. And war in the Netherlands always means Second World War. Different if you give a talk in the United States, you talk about war. Yeah, which war do you mean? Vietnam, Korea, First Gulf War, Second Gulf War, etc. But the Netherlands was neutral during World War I. So the war is Second World War. You were born before the war, after the war. That's easy. It's now called Dutch Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So the institute tried to cover all the killings in the world. So it's very difficult, of course. I was and still very interested in collaboration, because I can imagine when your country is invaded by a foreign nation that you are against it. If you go into resistance, that's not a way, but you are against it, period. Being helpful and going to the side of the enemy, that is completely different. And that's much more interesting. So I think that's much more interesting. So I have been working on that for some time. But end of 1980, my life changed completely. Otto Frank, the father of Anne, died. And in his last will, he had bequeathed all the diaries of Anne Frank, everything she has written, to my institute. The Anne Frank Foundation, who runs the Anne Frank House on the Prinsengracht in Amsterdam, was not amused, because they thought, of course, that they would get the diaries. But he decided otherwise. Our interest in having the diaries was not big. And it has to do with the fact that Anne Frank, and I talk about the 80s, was seen as, something for foreigners. The house on the Prinsengracht was visited by tourists, not by Dutch people. Sometimes when Dutch people had family or friends over who said, I want to visit the Anne Frank house, okay, I will go with you. But Anne Frank was not part of Dutch history, so to say. My director at that time was more clever than the rest of the institute. He decided to do really something with this most important document of the Second World War. He asked me and a younger colleague to sit together and to decide what to do. One of the first things was that the three of us has never read the diary at all. And we were thinking about it, how come? And my theory was, and still is, it was a girl's book, or it is in my idea a girl's book. And why should I be interested as a 12-year-old boy about menstruation problems of a girl, of I love my daddy and I hate my mother, that kind of stuff. You don't read it. I went my local pub in that evening and asked everybody from my age, around my age, if we read Anne Frank diary. Almost all the men said no, and almost all the women said yes. There were a few men who said, yeah, read it. And I was a little bit puzzled, so I thought, there goes my theory. They had sisters. And when a boy has a sister, he will read girls' books, and the other way around, his sister will read boys' books. So I still kept my theory. My director said this is the most important document. We are an institute what writes books, what produced also documents. We will document what Anne Frank has written. And we realized, we knew that a little bit already, that Anne Frank, what you can buy in the bookshop is not what Anne Frank has written. Anne Frank has written 2 diaries. She started to write she started her diary before she went into hiding. And in 1944, in March, they were 2 years in hiding. They were listening every day to the Dutch radio beamed from London, and sometimes members of the cabinet in exile in London, they talked on the radio. And this time, the Minister of Education gave a talk on the radio where he explained that after the war, he wanted to found an institute where he would collect all the stuff from the war. And not only the official things, but also diaries, letters from ordinary people. And that triggered Anne Frank to think about her own diary, and she writes about it. And then after a few weeks, she started to rewrite her diary. And in the end, and I mean when the Germans invaded the house, she had not finished her rewriting, but at the same time, she was just going on in her first diary. So we have 2 diaries about the same period. And Otto Frank had, of course, a problem. It was already very difficult to find a publisher to publish the diary of a completely unknown girl, but to publish 2 diaries, that would, of course, impossible. So he started to make a combination of the diaries. He started with her second diary, but because she hadn't finished that until the time the Germans came in, he used her second diary to finish it. And of course, when you go to a publishing house, there are editors, and editors are, the name is obvious, they edit your book, if you want it or not. So they edited also things. I will tell about that later, what the publishing house did. What we have done in our book is to publish on 1 page, and then it's 300 pages, on 1 page her first diary, her second diary, and what you can buy in the bookshop. So you can see for yourself what the differences are, what she has changed. For instance, in her first diary, she writes 2 or 3 pages about the school kids in her school class, one by one, and she's quite negative about them. She's very critical. In her second diary, she skips that completely. I think with the idea that things, nobody's interested in my schoolmates. So that's why she changed other things too. Some things are important. Some things you ask yourself, why did she change that? But nevertheless, you can see what happened. I must say there is one problem. You can see in the Dutch language, you can see how she improves her Dutch. In her first diary, she makes a lot of mistakes and scribbles and another word instead of the first word. In her second diary, she writes fluently in one stretch. If you translate it, that is impossible. If you make a mistake in the Dutch language and you translate this mistake into English, readers will think, there's something, what's a strange translation is this? Somebody stupid. In Dutch, it's very obvious that she's young and she makes mistakes. In every translation, it falls apart. But you can see the big differences. What we also did, we wrote introductions about the history of the Frank family, how the book was published, how a play was made of it, etc., etc. We'll tell you a little bit more about it. One of the interesting things is the change. Now, for instance, maybe you know and you have seen in the diary you've read in your book, that in 1942 she mentions that on BBC, the BBC radio, there is mentioning about gassing Jews in Poland. And that's true. We went to the archives of the BBC, and around that time it was on the air. The strange thing is, she doesn't have it in her first diary, but she has it in a second diary, 2 years later. So we cannot ask her, but how come? I can imagine that the first time that she heard it on the radio and that the people in hiding said, that's propaganda from the English. So she didn't write it down. But I cannot imagine that after 2 years later that she remembered it. Oh, yes, let's write it down. There are two possibilities, I think. Her sister Margot was also writing a diary. We know that. It's lost. We never found it. It can be that her sister helped her with the rewriting of her diary and said, oh yeah, here 42 there was something happening which you don't have, and I had it. It can be that her father remembered it, but we will never know. That is and stays a strange part of a diary. The second interesting thing is the differences between the first translations. Of course, translations of a book has always differences. It's impossible to translate a book 100%. There are differences, but what kind of differences? In this case, we found out that in her written diary, and it's not in the published Dutch version, she mentioned something what happened years before when she was 6 or 5, and she had to sleep over at her best friend, and that she asked her best friend to see each other's breasts. The girl refused. That's not in the Dutch publication from 1947. But we found out that it was in the English translation from 1950. And we were a little bit amazed about that. The translator was still alive, Miss Moyart. We went to visit her and we asked what she had translated. And she said, now, just here, the book, I had the 5th edition, of the 3rd edition of the Dutch version, I've translated it. And you could see scribbles in the margins. We showed her this difference, and she said, how's that possible? And very good for historians, she had kept her own archive of letters. So she went to look in her archive and she found a letter written by Otto Frank. Dear Miss Moyart, I know you've almost finished your translation into English. Here are some lines the Dutch publisher refused to publish. And that was those lines. Those lines were seen in the 50s as too sexual. Nowadays, you and a lot of other people think that the Netherlands is the country of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But in the 50s, we were a very Calvinist country. But it was very good that she had please keep your letters for later, that she had this letter from Otto Frank. Otherwise, we would never known how this strange, completely innocent thing happened. We published the diaries. There was a little problem. One member of parliament was against our publication because he said they're going to publish things her father didn't want to publish. Isn't that terrible? The poor man died, etc., etc. We could easily answer that it is a little bit strange that she was okay that Otto Frank published the diary of his daughter. I mean, who is going to publish a diary? What's the most personal thing somebody has? He did it. Why he did it, he always explained it that people after the war asked him, how was life in hiding? and he was the only survivor of the eight Jews in hiding. And they realized that his daughter has written it all down. That's why he published it. And more than that, he had the idea that Anne Frank had a message for the world. Dus after the first publication in 1947 in the Netherlands, he has been very, very, very active to promote the diary of his daughter. He was very active in finding translations. Here in the United States, a play was staged, was first written and staged. A movie was produced in 1959. So more and more Anne Frank became important. At the beginning, it had good reviews in the Netherlands, but there was also some protest from the Jewish community who said, yes, now we are having tears about a poor girl what lost her life, but during wartime you didn't help us. So there was an ambivalent idea about the success, the little success. The success came after a play made in the United States where Anne Frank, a Jewish girl in hiding in Amsterdam, became more or less a lively teenager who had trouble with her mother but loved her father. And oh yes, they were in hiding. Germans, we think. The Jewish part was completely played down in the play. There was hardly any mentioning of, and a few things who were Jewish, for instance, Hanukkah things, were completely into English for not alienating the public. The movie is the same. And if you look at the advertising of the movie, it's about her first kiss, a thrilling adventure, not the Holocaust movie we think it should be. When the movie came to the Netherlands, the Anne Frank house, the house, nobody went there. It was not a museum, and even had plans to build a new building there. But with the play and the movie, small organizations started. Oh, we have to keep this house here intact because tourists will come here, and that's true nowadays. Before COVID, it was 1 million a year. So the house of Prinsengracht became very, very important, and international exhibitions, which were organized by the Anne Frank Foundation, became very, very important. By the way, our book was published in, I think, 5 languages, and 100,000 copies worldwide were sold. What's a lot for a scientific book, scholarly book. And when friends told me, I bought your book about Anne Frank, I asked, and what do you think about it? No, I've given to my parents as a present. So it's difficult to read. I mean, you have to read 3 versions about the same episode. Anne Frank in the USA is very, very important. I think without the USA, Anne Frank wouldn't have been so important, so famous, world famous. The book was a success with very positive reviews in the New York Review of Books. Those reviews were written by Meyer Levin, who himself had been active for the translation of the book, and he became very active pushing Otto Frank that he wanted to play the script, to write a script for a play. Okay, Otto Frank agreed if a producer would produce his version. That didn't happen. More than 10 producers saw the script of Meyer Levin, and no, they didn't want it. In the end, Meyer Levin became very, very, very active in promoting his play, and he even has written a book about it. And his theory is, and I think he is a little bit right, that they found his play too Jewish. They wanted, they didn't want a Jewish play in the 50s in the United States. They were afraid they wouldn't get any audience, a real big audience. So when the play was made by Goodrich and Hackett, a team from Hollywood, you can say that the Jewishness was completely away. The play was a little bit rewritten 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and it's now more Jewish, more accurate, you can say. So Meyer Levin was right, I think. The movie is partly interesting because it's a movie that plays in one set. There are few outset things, but it's kind of closed room, like they were into hiding. And although the play was very successful, the movie was not so. Was less popular. A quote from my own book: "We may have to look for explanation in American socio-political situation at the time. This was personified in a beautiful photo taken during the New York movie premiere of Shelley Winters, one of the players, as well as Martin Luther King Jr., Harry Belafonte, and both their wives on one photo. For millions of Americans who want nothing to do with black civil rights, this photo must have been a sign to stay away. A Jewish actress, Shelley Winters, with left-wing ideas, who supported the civil rights movement, of which King was the undisputed leader. Many American Jews had, as lawyer, lobbyist, or activist, supported the black struggle for civil rights." It's still something I want to find out if I'm right or not, but it's very difficult to collect data from movie theaters. It costs a lot of money and time to do that. I remember I've seen the play at school when I was 12, I think, or 13, and we all thought, I remember it was very Hollywood, and that was also the idea in the Netherlands. Hollywood has to keep his hands off our Anne Frank. That was the idea. This is about an introduction. Who betrayed Anne Frank? You can say, is that important? Some people say, no, it's not important. Much more people have been betrayed. And in the end, the Germans who killed them, not the betrayers. But on February 17 this year, a new book came on the market, The Betrayal of Anne Frank, a cold case investigation written by Rosemary Sullivan. And it has more impact than any recent book on history. Also because your program, 60 Minutes, had paid attention, was more commercial than a report the evening before. The book was published in different languages at the same time. And there's been more books published about the betrayal of Anne Frank, but this one really hit hard. Partly because the big news was a Jewish notary, Van den Berg, had a list of Jews in hiding that he got from the Amsterdam Jewish Council, an organization on whose board he once sat. He had given the Germans the address where the Frank family and others were hidden to save his own skin. That was a theory in the book. The name Van den Berg was not new. I've mentioned him in a book from 2003, Who Betrayed Anne Frank, but I didn't see him as a perpetrator. The book looked like a serious study, over 300 pages. The book was just The Betrayal of Anne Frank. Over 300 pages, with hundreds of footnotes and dozens of names of external specialists, and boasting about the use of forensic research, big data, and artificial intelligence. But within days, Dutch historians were very negative about the research and the results. They said that the Jewish Council didn't have addresses of Jews in hiding, so the notary could not have them from the council. And the notary himself was in hiding, so why should he have informed the Germans? The publishing house regretted the book, apologized, and even withdrew the book from the bookshops. In Germany, they are still hesitating to publish the book, but here in the USA, the book is still available. Why this uproar? You can say everything about Anne Frank gives a kind of uproar, but this was really, really hard. It is new that an ex-FBI officer and non-historians were doing historical research, calling it forensic research. You can also call it competition between old-style historians and new-style so-called historians. But in this case, the real historians were right in stating that the cold case team was bad research. It seemed also new that a Jew was pinpointed as traitor of Jews, but that is nonsense. After the war, 40 war criminals were executed in the Netherlands, and one of them was a Jewish traitor, Hans van Dijk, who was also the only woman executed after the war. But people now explained that telling Jews were betrayed by Jews was helping anti-Semitism. I do not believe so. And I think you cannot hide facts when they are true. But in this case, the research was wrong and Van den Berg didn't betray anybody. Second part is very stranger. Who owns Anne Frank in this 21st century? Nobody owns Anne Frank, you can say, but still there are people who do it. There are different actors. You have the Anne Frank Stichting or Foundation in Amsterdam, founded by Otto Frank in 1957, who owns the house at the Prinsengracht in Amsterdam. You have the Anne Frank Foundation in Basel, Switzerland, founded by Otto Frank in 1963, who owns the copyright. They both claim to speak in the spirit of Anne Frank and her father, and they want to decide what is good or wrong around Anne, which movie is okay or not. There are two women, Jacqueline van Maassen, who claims to be her best friend, and Eva Schloss, who calls herself the stepsister of Anne Frank. Otto Frank remarried after the war with her father, so technically she's stepsister. They were competing very much, those two women, but at last they had a peace deal and they went together on tours in the world to tell the people what Anne Frank was thinking when she was young. And I'm also one of the actors, an independent one, I hope, who tries to explain what happened or even what will happen in the future, what is very strange for an historian. I try to be independent, so sometimes I'm at peace and sometimes at war with the foundation in Switzerland or with foundation in Amsterdam. Those foundations are also competing with each other because, let's be fair, it's about money and about a lot of money. And the Anne Frank Foundation in Basel collects the money and gives it away to all good things, but they also want to be active in what Anne Frank is thinking and what you can do or not do with Anne Frank, which play is okay, which movie is okay. I try to explain what is happening, and sometimes I think when it's really bad taste, I tell it. But sometimes you say, yeah, they've made that movie okay. If people like it, be it. It's not my stuff, but who am I to say what's good or wrong? But those institutions are very sure about themselves what's good or wrong. To tell you a little bit more what will happen, and this is about my last book, The Phenomenon of Anne Frank. What will happen? More textual analysis will be done on Anne's writings, something that can be done more extensively since the 1986 publication of the critical edition, The Diaries of Anne Frank. In 2003, your famous museum, Holocaust Museum in Washington, had its 10 years anniversary, and they had an exhibition called Anne Frank the Writer. Not Anne Frank the victim, it's Anne Frank the writer. I've told you already that an analysis of the development of a language can only be done with a Dutch edition, because in translation you're losing a lot of content. But thanks to the critical edition, it's now possible to look carefully at the differences in content between the first and the second version. Researchers will dive into old material, for instance, interviews made in the 60s. There are some documentaries made in the 60s, which are now very interesting. One of the disadvantages is that Otto Frank has never been interviewed in a critical way. All his interviews are a little bit the same. And it has to do, maybe, I think, with the fact that the father of a little saint, and Frank became a little saint, it's difficult to ask critical questions. It's more kind of, oh, please, will you tell about the war? And we write it down. Het Achterhuis, that's the name, the Dutch name of her novel, will slowly but surely be included in the canon of world literature. Even though writers like Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi, to name only two, have given a more pronounced literary voice to the Holocaust. Let's be fair, Anne Frank's book is not about the Holocaust. It's at the start of the Holocaust. And one of the reasons why the book is still very popular, it's not, there is hardly, or there is no blood on the pages. And a second point why it's so popular is that as a young girl, 12, 13, she has no strict opinions about what's happening around her or in the world. When you're 30 or 40, you have more or less strict opinions. Not everybody, but at that time. So people from every denomination can take whatever they want from her diary. Jews can take the Jewish part of it, non-Jews take the non-Jewish part. So everybody can cite parts of it. Oh, see, that's my Anne Frank. The question is, will Anne, and I mean, Anne will not change Anne Frank, but in the opinion, public opinion, of course she will change. Will she become more Jewish in an orthodox sense, or Jewish in a more liberal sense? Since the beginning, Otto Frank clearly pushed Anne's Jewish side into the background and never actually reconsidered it. There are photos of Otto Frank with numerous religious people like the Pope, or with the Dominican priest Dominique Pierre of Anne Frank villages for refugees, but photos with the rabbi are rare. What is said, a renewed play of 1997 is a bit more Jewish, but its stage Anne hardly at all. If she remains exclusively a Holocaust victim, she could become more Jewish. But if Anne becomes a more universal victim of all suffering, that certainly won't happen. At the end of, say, 10 years ago, the copyright of the Dutch version expired. And you can say it was now free for all, but that didn't happen. But there is still discussion about if the book is protected by copyright or not. And in this case, you can call it follow the money if you do research. Is growth still possible for the more than 1 million visitors to the Prinsengracht, where they were hidden? And if so, how? By extending opening times, more people can enter. But in the summer, the house on Prinsengracht is all open until 10 p.m. If you can make the rooms bare by not giving explanations on the walls, the visitor flow will be faster. This is desirable. It's clear there will be more visitors, for tourism is increasingly everywhere. The Anne Frank House will continue to grow. It's striking that the exposition is mostly occurring abroad. Various Anne Frank exhibitions can be seen annual in more than 200 cities in dozens of countries. And they are visited by thousands, and in every country something appropriate is added. In Argentina, attention is paid to the military dictatorship of the past, and soldiers in training visit the exhibition. They will, of course, know better than to participate in military coup, is the idea. A National Anne Frank Day was declared in Argentina, and an Anne Frank monument can even be found in Buenos Aires. After visiting the exhibition in Soweto, South Africa, useful visitors will hopefully contribute to a more tolerant South Africa by spreading the message of Anne Frank. The political components in the exhibitions abroad are conspicuous, but these have been absent in the Netherlands for years. After the 60s and the 70s of the last century, there is now an apolitical period on Prinsengracht, where the emphasis is on the house and on internet. It can be expected that the historicism tendency will continue. They will show the historical Anne Frank, her family, the helpers inside and outside, and the surroundings of the annex. The replica of the work barracks in Westerbork, that's the transit lager where she stayed before she was sent to Germany and Auschwitz. They have an Anne Frank seal. Gradually, the Holocaust will play a smaller role in the image around Anne. An increasing number of people connect Anne with their own story. Anne Frank's story is my story, on the suffering of their ancestors. Anne is linked with the struggle against all evil in the world. In 2015, a television documentary was aired in the Netherlands called In Line for Anne Frank, and it shows this very well. A number of people waiting in a long line to visit the annex were asked why they were standing there. A black man from the South, Alabama, connected Anne's lot with that of his ancestor in the struggle against racial discrimination, and two Tibetan monks see much of Anne in the Dalai Lama. In a later documentary, The Magic of Anne Frank, a number of national and international public figures were interviewed about Anne, and the Holocaust hardly mentioned in their answers. Jeffrey Wright, American actor, even tells the interviewer, "I am a survivor." And the American General Wesley Clark managed to connect the NATO bombing of Belgrade in 1990 to Anne's diary. What's remarkable. In the 21st century, people are less likely to believe in the inner goodness of people than in the 50s. Yet it's Anne's optimistic and lively side that will attract new readers, new visitors. And just recently, last Sunday New York Times, a new documentary about the Holocaust opens with photos of perhaps the most familiar face from the dark chapter of history, those of Anne Frank and her family, whose story has been read or seen by millions around the world. The phenomenon of Anne Frank will continue on. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
Please.
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned the message of Anne Frank and how people all around the world connect with her, but do you think that over time, as Hollywood and different forms of media portray her in different ways, her own, I guess the way that the world perceives Anne and her name will begin to shroud her own words, that her voice will affect? Do you think it's possible that her voice will be lost as her name and her face become more popular replacements for her actual message?
It's an interesting question, because what is the message of Anne Frank? I have no idea. I know her diary, I can read it, but her message? You can say that the play made here in the United States in the 50s is a message of optimism. And it's very strange, because in the 50s you have two tendencies, kind of optimism. Second World War is We don't think about it. We have a new future. But at the same time, the bomb, the Third World War was there. But the play is the optimistic view, and the play ends with a quote from Anne Frank, I believe in the good of all people. People have seen the play saying that's the end of the diary. That would be very strange. That just before the Germans invaded, she wrote something like that. It's written a few days before, but the playwrights who wrote it, the play, it's of course very clever. It ends very positive. People go, see this, it's not a poor girl, it's almost a survivor. She's a victim, she's not a survivor. And by changing of the play, nowadays when you see the play, it ends more accurately, mostly by photos of the 7 people who were killed with their names and what happened with them. But the message of Anne Frank, and that's what I try to explain, it's the message, what one takes out of it. What I say, those Tibetan monks see the Dalai Lama, whatever message he has, I don't know, but that he does the same as Anne Frank or somebody from the South. So that's Anne Frank, and her books are still sold, and it's for millions of people the first and sometimes the last book what they read about the start of the Holocaust. And partly the play is also used in high schools, also in the United States, partly because it's interesting play, and partly there are more than, I think, 12 or 15 characters in it. So 15 kids can have a part in this play. But her voice will not be lost, but her voice will change with what you want to hear, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
Sure.
One potential actor in this ecosystem, I guess, that you didn't mention is the family that hid the Frank family, and I know there's been some stuff written about that family. Can you say anything about that? Is there some legacy there that's connected to this?
Yeah, and there are also a few in it. Go into hiding. If you are a Jewish family and you know only Jews, you cannot go in hiding. You cannot go in hiding with the other Jewish family because they are chased out too. Otto Frank had a lot of non-Jewish people he knew, where he worked with, or he was a businessman. So he had already was living in a partly non-Jewish surrounding. His wife was with other German Jews who went to the Netherlands in the 30s, stayed with each other, with a German Jewish community, a little bit complaining how old-fashioned Amsterdam was compared with modern Germany. And one of the people, Otto Frank, had good contacts, but also his wife, is Miep Gies. She worked in the business of Otto Frank, but they became friends too, playing cards together, etc. So when Otto Frank asked her, "Can you help us?" she said yes. Later, Miep Gies was shown as a kind of almost a saint that helped people, etc. And everybody they had the same story always. And there is one very interesting interview, not well known. And there she explains why and how. Not saying we in good character with that. She said, he was my boss and he had treated me very well. And that's why I said yes. You can imagine if he had treated her miserable, she would have said no. And I can imagine. But it was also new, quite liberal, that before the war, that the boss and the secretary, that they were friends. I mean, the Netherlands before the war was not this case. So she was surprised, of course, but on the other hand, also, okay, he has been a very good boss. I can do something back. And interesting thing, she herself was from Austria. And after the First World War, Austria was exhausted from the First World War. And they lost Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc. The big Habsburg Reich stumbled down, and there was Austrian girls, and also boys, not thousands of them, but hundreds of them went to the Netherlands, a very rich country. We were neutral in the First World War, to get fat on the bones, and then go back home. She stayed in the Netherlands, and she became Dutch, and etc. And she was from Vienna. And when the Germans invaded, was one officer and three Dutch. And the officer was officially German, but he came from Vienna, and he could hear accent. So it became on one side a little bit friendlier. On the other side, he found it terrible that one of his own Viennese were helping Jews. When Otto Frank came back after the war, he had lost everything. And he stayed with Miep Gies and her husband for some time. So they were very good friends. So she has been very important for in hiding. But you would also see that this type of in hiding is not normal. Most of the people in hiding went on their own, or a kid went to completely strangers. We know from 3 or 4 families who went together into hiding, and you can say that a big group has more possibility to be betrayed than a small group, but it's not really true. They stayed more than 2 years into hiding in the center of Amsterdam. And you can say that toddlers and even babies, Jewish babies, will have a absolute bigger chance to survive if they were taken in by farmers in the north or in the south. Mostly, and it must be unfaced, a couple who couldn't get kids themselves. So it was in this case, how strange it sounds, a win-win situation. Those people had a child, and the child survived. But Miep Gies has been very, very instrumental in helping them through because 8 people, everything was rationed, on rationing. You couldn't buy the stuff just like that, and you need coupons, etc. Our people in hiding didn't have coupons, so it was really difficult to find enough food for 8 people. But she has done a very good job. Yeah.
Was she punished at all when they were discovered?
No. The story is after the war, non-Jewish people were telling, yes, it was very dangerous to help Jews. You were shot by the Germans. That's not true. But people used it after the war to. 2 male helpers were arrested. One of them got free after 3 months. He was ill, and the other one escaped during when he was sent to Germany. So the Germans were strict on. There's an example of a farmer south from Amsterdam who had at one time, the first time, I think 20 Jews in hiding, and the Germans got hold of it and invaded, arrested them all, and he got a strong warning. And a half year later, again, he had 20 Jews there. He came in a camp, but he survived. The Germans were strict if somebody who was hiding Jews was also dealing in arms against the Germans. But the story that he would be shot by helping Jews was, let's say, an invention after the war to clear your own chest. And also the Germans said during wartime, there will be severe punishments if you help Jews. So it's both sides. Yes, please.
I'd like to ask something a little different, just to get your thought. Before you got into talking about the betrayal and the phenomenon, you gave a very interesting background. So, in terms of your own life, your father, and many, many others, what was happening in the 30s, the 40s, and setting up a kind of context then. And what I wanted to ask you for any thoughts you might have, most of us are alarmed today when we look at what's happening in Eastern Europe, other parts of Europe, the United States, with this upsurge of anti-Semitism and also racism and sexism and hatred and so forth, autocracy, white nationalism, all of this. Are there certain things from your research that you did, certain lessons or what was happening, say, in the Netherlands and in Europe in the 30s, 40s, that you see, are there some lessons for what we're observing is happening right now in Europe and other parts of the world?
I think it's very difficult for an historian to, then you don't talk as a historian, more as a person. History is important to know, to learn. But when you see the Balkan countries, I would be happy if they hadn't read history books, because in their history book is stated that 200 years ago, my country was much bigger than the other country. And all those different countries, those different history books where they were bigger than the other. Yeah, that leads to war if you want to do that. And learning from history, I don't think we learn from history. When, for instance, the Anne Frank Foundation in Amsterdam was, besides being the house where Anne lived, was also active in anti-racist movement. But they did it in the way like, if you say something ugly about Turkish immigrants, Auschwitz is around the corner. That is not true. Auschwitz is not around the corner if you say something like that. So if you make it bigger than it is, it doesn't help. And all those things like nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism have been around for centuries. And the idea that after the Second World War all would over is a kind of optimism was absolutely nonsense, I think. But those things are never over. Problem for nowadays is it's not our enemy, it's also our friend, is of course internet. Things go much more quicker and much easier than in earlier times. And it's also, now we think we know everything. In the Netherlands, there has been a debate among historians and also survivors. What did people know during wartime about Auschwitz? Now we think, for instance, this documentary about what will, on Sunday, the first part will air, exploring in action during the Holocaust. America didn't open their gates for all the Jews who want to go here. But at that moment, Auschwitz didn't exist. And when America came into war with Germany, there was no free flow of visitors from Germany to America and other way. In the Netherlands was a discussion on, did you really know about the Holocaust, about the killing? You can say, no, Anne Frank is writing it, that I was guessing, so she knew. I say, she wrote it down in 1944, 2 years later. And there's an interesting, another diary writer, Etty Hillison, 5 years older. On one page she writes, I think we all will be killed in the East. And the second page said, what kind of shoes shall I take with me? So there is a kind of knowledge and non-knowledge. And say, oh, we knew we would be killed. No, I don't think so. When you see there is the SS commander of Westerbork, the camp where the Jews were collected before they were sent away. When you see there is a documentary made by the proud commander, where you see a train on the ramp and Jews go into the train. They say goodbye to the others and wave away, etc. It's not that you think, well, I'm a historian, not a psychologist. Those are not people who know that in 4 days they will be killed. And even you can also think, but that's also unbearable to say, that the Jews in Western Germany, in the West, so yeah, there will be killings in the East, but those are the Ostjuden, not the civilized Juden from the West who know Goethe and Schiller, etc. So even those kind of things, you hope, of course, not. My opinion is that I think people didn't know, but are you only going to help people if they're going to be killed, is my question. I think you also have to help people who are in danger. It's easy to tell, I was born after the war, but that's more or less what I can say about it. And it's more as a private person than as a historian. Your last possibilities?
Yeah.
Yes,
One more
please.
question? Yeah.
You mentioned that when your institute first got the diaries, that you did an informal poll of who was reading in your country, and that it was very gendered. And do you, and yet when you talked about people in the line, the quotes were all from people who were, I think it sounded like they were all men.
No, they're all female in the line, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But then other like, Richard Wright and whatever. So do you think that there's another text that middle schoolers would be encouraged to read in companion that would be more attractive because we live in a gendered world, and as much as that seems to be a little bit loosening, that this idea of boys' books and girls' books still hasn't broken down, and to have students be made aware of these issues?
Nowadays, since I think since 20, 30 years, and Frank is read at school by boys and girls. So my idea of a girl's book is fading away slowly. So it's part of it. And for instance, the Anne Frank Foundation Amsterdam started to make a so-called Anne Frank newspaper, for every school kid every year. So Anne Frank is now since 20, 30 years, not only for tourists, but she's also Dutch. And Frank is nowadays a Dutch, heroine, victim, survivor. She's not a survivor, but can you be a heroine and a victim? That's a problem, of course.
Okay. Thank you, David Barnouw. Unfortunately, we haven't found a way to beam this through the streaming devices, but there are some refreshments here in the room with us. That's the perk you get for being here live. So we have some time to have something to eat, have a cup of coffee, water, whatever, and talk amongst ourselves. And again, thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you again to David Barnouw.
Thank you.